Welcome to Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder. Barnaby's is one of the leading search engines for art, design, antiques and collectibles from over 3,000 auction houses worldwide. We aim to make the art and auction market more transparent and accessible to everyone, from beginners to collectors and professionals. Welcome to Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder, Ruby Redstone, fashion historian from New York City with a master in fashion history at Courtauld Institute of Art in London as well.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
So, how did you get into vintage fashion?
I took a little bit of a backwards route into the arena of fashion history. I started working in design when I was really young. I became a shoe designer at Marc Jacobs. I started working there when I was 13, which now I see a 13-year-old and that feels insane to me. But I started working there at 13 and loved making shoes, loved all of that. But I found that I worked there for years and years until I was 18 or 19, old by then. But I realized every season that my favorite part was not actually doing design. It was doing the months of research that came before design, which involved going to libraries, scanning old magazines, looking through. We would even use fashion plates from like the 1700s for our sketches. So realized that that was really my passion, and that coincided with studying art history in school. So then I went on to do my BA in art history at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And then after that, realized that most of what I'd been interested in the whole time I was in school was still what people were wearing in paintings rather than the paintings themselves. So went on to do my master's in fashion history. And while I was doing that, worked at both museums and in more contemporary fashion areas.
So, you know all about the person when you see an old master, I guess, then?
Yes, I'm not an old masters expert, I must say, but I would say I know a pretty good amount about what everyone's wearing from 1200 to 1960.
That's impressive. So, where do you source your vintage fashion then? Because you obviously have quite a closet, don't you?
Yes, I'm building the world's smallest archive in my closet. um, but, but I must say I source pretty much everything online. I have some stores in New York that I like, some abroad, but I mostly buy everything through eBay, Etsy. I do buy things at auction from time to time, and then I also do like vintage fairs with people who travel and bring clothes.
Oh, yeah. So you are one of them who says that you don't actually need to try them on before buying them?
Yes, which is risky. But I mean, that's a risk with any vintage garment. But yeah, I just pray for the best every time.
Yeah. But it used to be good, I guess.
Yeah, yes. I think years of practice, I've gotten pretty good at gauging.
Yeah, that's good. By buying vintage clothes and avoiding fast fashion, you are by default consuming in a more sustainable way than most people. Did you always have environmental concerns, or did it all start purely because of your passion for the vintage style?
This has actually been on my mind a lot lately because my New Year's resolution for 2023 was to not buy a single item of new clothing, to buy everything used, secondhand, vintage, etc. Um, but the reality of this is that that's how I've been living my life for a while, aside from buying like a few, t-shirts or small accessories new. Um, and partially that's sustainability and environmental concerns, but partially that is what's available within my budget. And especially being involved in the world of fashion from a young age, you see people dressed incredibly, and you know that you simply don't have the budget to afford what they're wearing. So you have to find other means to emulate that look. And for me, that was really the start of loving vintage. As I would say, oh my gosh, I saw the most amazing dress. I could never afford it. Let me see if, maybe 50 years ago, someone designed something similar that I can now hunt down. And that definitely spiraled or transformed into a passion for the vintage garments themselves rather than using them as a duplicate of something new.
With the world's increased focus on sustainability, I mean, it's not just you, right? So do you see
Yeah.
vintage fashion becoming more popular in general?
Yes, which is so inspiring. Like it's really amazing. I mean, even as I was saying, these vintage fairs that I go to, it used to be that you could go and there would be like 15 people and they're milling about, and now I go and there's a line out the door to get in, which is incredible.
Mm,
And I definitely see an increased just vocabulary amongst people. Everyone now has a bit of an interest in knowing what time period something is from, and they all have a lot more concerns about construction and how a garment will last, which is amazing, amazing to see. And obviously, you're going
mm,
to find that in the world of vintage much more than you are shopping at Zara or H&M or anywhere like that.
mm. So you would say actually that the knowledge is greater today for fashion
I
in
think
general.
so.
Mm.
And it gives me hope. I mean, obviously, I would say that the generation slightly below me is not as concerned as I am with like finding a beautiful Victorian top, but they do love finding jeans from the 90s. And,
Yeah,
if that stops them from buying a new pair of jeans that created, 10 gallons of wastewater, then that's fabulous.
yeah, yeah. Have you noticed any change on the market since you started buying secondhand clothes? I mean, you mentioned the line of people outside, but do you see also the prices increasing? And
Absolutely. And it's totally changed what people value, which sometimes works out for me. People aren't as into the little 30s and 40s silk dresses as they were maybe 15 years ago. So the price in those goes down. But alternatively, the price in buying, like, I mean, I see wild prices on just, juicy couture sweatpants from 2010. But at the same time, the explosion of apps in terms of vintage resale has been incredible. And I've found stuff for that you just wouldn't be able to find anywhere else for quite low prices. So I think
mm,
it's a give and take. Like the market drives whatever people are interested in any given moment, but we also have such a wider range of options and places to shop.
yeah. But does this means also that it's harder to find the great pieces, or?
Yes, and there's way more competition. I've even noticed on eBay. I see many more people bidding on things that that I want.
Yeah. But does that also has? I mean, you mentioned the Victorian top. Is that something that the interest has increased for that as well, or is it more, as you said, the 80s and 90s, or you have competition for the Victorian top as well?
I I think it's still in the 80s and 90s. When you get into collecting antique pieces or really anything before 1940, it's kind of a different game, as I'm sure you know. Then you're
Mm,
talking to more serious collectors. And I do think I'm a bit unique from that in that most of what I buy, I want to wear because I myself am not a museum and I don't collect for anyone else. So
yeah.
I'm still looking for things that are in wearable condition. But of course, you get tempted by these beautiful dresses that can only ever be displayed. But I think those are kind of safely in their own realm.
When it comes to the auction market as well, uh, if you look at the trends, it's normally that the new generation come into the market with a with a filled wallet, or how you say,
Mhm.
um, they they tend to start to purchase the things that they grew up with or they saw their grandmother and grandfather had in their homes, etc. Um, but have you noticed a change also when it comes to the brands that people are looking for? Has that shifted as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of funny to see, as you're saying, to see a generation slightly below you become interested in things that you grew up with or that you perceived as household names. I would say that Prada is having a huge moment with that in terms of resale. Like,
Mm,
you know, I loved Prada when I first got into fashion, had a mom who was a big, Prada devotee back in the day. And then now you see this younger generation of people in their late teens, early 20s who are just discovering that. And I always find that really inspiring to see. Again, I get a bit sad for myself because it means that the prices are going to be driven up. But
mm,
I love seeing anyone get that kind of recognition because it means that they stay alive in our collective memory. I think we're about to see that with Vivienne Westwood because she's had real renewed interest from younger audiences and then she just passed away. And so I'm sad that the fashion world has lost her, but I'm excited that it's at a time when her legacy has momentum.
there has been some scandals, I would say, lately with some fashion brands, not least in social media, where famous people are, how do you say, well, they're announcing that they won't collaborate with those brands or they, don't stand behind them anymore. But does that also impact the secondary market? or is that
Um,
mainly the primary market?
Unfortunately, I do not think it affects the secondary market. Well, unfortunately or not unfortunately, I always think it's important to remember when we look at these scenarios that this is not new. Coco Chanel was an adamant supporter of the Nazis, and so in her time, you had a lot of people saying that they would never buy Chanel. She
Hmm.
was cast out of certain social circles, and then we see 100 years later that that part of her legacy has been completely erased. And if anything, it's only increased the value of things designed by her because, you know, uh, that's kind of how history's memory works. So I think again, these things are more of a flash in the pan, and that unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who's who's
Yeah.
looking at it, they have no real impact on the later value of items.
As a fashion historian, do you have a favorite period in fashion history? And which one is that?
This is a tough question because I love everything, and even the
Yeah.
things I don't like. If I spend enough time with it, I'll come away loving it.
Yeah.
Um, but my area of expertise is American women's wear in the 1930s, so that's a
Hmm.
particular passion of mine. And then I also love anything British or American Victorian.
Hmm. And when you say American 1930s, what is that, to be honest? What kind of
I
clothes?
do. Um, so this is great because I do think in terms of our cultural picture of fashion history, people have a very strong idea when you say the 20s, they can picture flappers, they can picture, bob haircuts, but we don't have a great memory about the 30s. And of course, in my opinion, it's a much better era design wise. You get this wonderful sort of hangover from the interwar period where people still have money, but then as you enter World War II and the Great Depression, people start becoming thriftier, which I always think is actually better for style. You have this outpouring of homemade clothing, people repurposing Hollywood costumes as clothing. You get a lot of silk bias cut gowns. You get the rise of Hollywood celebrities. So you get feather trim, you get rhinestones, you get things that looked really amazing on camera. And you also have the rise of designers like Schiaparelli. So you have European couture being translated by wider audiences, which is always fun to see.
Is that typical for America, you would say, or do you see the same kind of fashion in France or Italy or?
The reason I particularly love American women's wear from that period, which is actually quite unusual because I'm usually much more of a French couture devotee when it comes to that. But in Europe, you see people hanging on to this idea of designers as the arbiters of taste for a much longer time than you do in America. Versus in the US, you have, it really is mostly thanks to the Great Depression, you have a turn away from that idea that everyone needs to buy designer clothing or emulate designer clothing to be fashionable. So you get this really cool moment in time where you get a sort of fresh start in America, and you have both American sportswear designers competing to be arbiters of taste, you have Hollywood costume designers competing for that, and you have women at home who are making the most of what they have and designing their own clothing and making it out of materials that you would find at home. So I just think it's a really fascinating moment in history where you kind of almost get to restart what style means for a brief moment. And we do still see the effects of that in American dress today.
Are there any specific designers that you look for when sourcing vintage fashion?
Yeah, I'm working again very slowly in my tiny museum to build up a collection of Prada and Miu Miu. So that's always my anything designed by Miuccia Prada I'm looking for. In terms of other designers, I care more about time period than designers. So I like to see every time period represented in my wardrobe. And gosh, anyone else who I collect? Let me think.
Hmm.
There are certain designers who are more on the niche side that I'll buy if I see because I care about it, like Marion Donaldson, who was a Scottish designer who brought 60s mod to Scotland. So she does these great 60s mod looks, but in British fabrics that would have been more native to Scotland. So you get Liberty florals and tartans and all that, which is fun to see. Um, but beyond that, I look way more for time period and for good examples of design from a time period rather than a brand name.
Hmm. But what about, you mentioned Prada, for example. Has the quality remained the same? Because obviously, when you take a look at antiques after the Second World War, the quality started, I mean, during the 50s, 60s, when you mass produced things, also the quality went down.
Yeah,
Do you see the same in the fashion history?
Yes, it's kind of a fine line because even more than with antiques or with artwork, clothing is very unstable to preserve. So you always have to ask yourself, why has something been preserved? The reality is that from any time period, the more cheaply made things, things that were worn a lot, things that, were part of someone's daily life are not going to be preserved very well. The clothing that we see existing is likely from a wealthy person's wardrobe. It's likely something that was made with a bit more care and attention than what the average person on the street was wearing. Sometimes you get lucky and you find something that is an example of everyday wear. But then, of course, on a whole, we see this trend everywhere and in every industry that things are just made cheaply and worse and not using natural fibers, which to me is one of the biggest parts of what I think we need to return to, because those are the most stable, those will last the longest, and they have a lower ecological toll than using synthetics, polyesters, and plastics.
If you, I mean, well, first of all, I mean, how has your fashion history background informed you when you do the vintage shopping? I mean, do you are you coming into a shop or a flea market or whatever, and you see the typical design from the period, or do you see the colors, or how do you behave when scouting, so to speak?
Yeah. Well, this is a great question because the nature of what I do means that I'm always looking at clothes, and then it always becomes, am I shopping or am I doing research right now? So it's always a little bit of both. Um, But I would say I'm super drawn to color. I'm a colorful person.
Mhm.
Beyond that, I kind of have a long list, both written out and in my phone, of what I'm always looking for. So that kind of guides what I'm looking to buy, because otherwise there would be no end to me just tracking down specific things. Um,
Mm.
and yeah, I think there is kind of a funny misconception or conception about what fashion historians do, which is most of the time I'm not out working with garments. It's like any historian profession where I'm mostly sitting at home with my ideas and reading books. And then everything I know about uh, identifying stitches and styles and all that is mostly from shopping vintage. It's honestly not from training as a fashion historian, because those are the kind of things that you would actually need to go to fashion school to learn about, X, Y, and Z types of embroidery. So I
Mm.
think it is a funny mix of both personal passion and professional work there.
Mm. Mm. I was once at in Paris to the Louis Vuitton museum, not the foundation,
Hmm.
but his studio where he lived actually. And I think the most amazing part was to enter his studio where he was making the dress or drawing the dress and try them on the
Yeah,
models and everything. And what was interesting, I think, was that the whole bookshelf was full of books of art. And when you see
yeah,
many of his dresses, they're really inspired by art. Can you also see that kind of, what do you say, a combination or between art and fashion?
yes, absolutely. And I mean, I think that is what truly sets apart a great designer from a good designer. Is a good designer knows how things work on the body, has a good taste in materials and colors, and a great designer is really plumbing those depths of art history and design history to choose something that's lasting and that touches on parts of culture beyond the immediate world of fashion, because that's what really anchors something in our world and gives it lasting power.
Hmm. What are your favorite pieces in your closet?
Oh God, that's hard. It's like choosing a favorite child in there. Um, Probably my favorite thing is I have a beautiful lace dress from the 20s that I bought when I was 15.
Mhm.
And, it gets worn at least once a month. It's in okay condition because it was in okay condition when I bought it, and then I wear it all the time. Um, and then I love shoes. Like I said, my background is in shoe design. So I have a lot of beloved pairs of shoes, including some that I never wear, like a pair of Manolo Blahniks that were based on Marie Antoinette's wardrobe, because she's my ultimate
Mhm.
style icon. And so those just sit on a shelf in my closet.
Mhm. Okay, nice. So how many pair of shoes do you have in your closet?
Very, I'm proud to say that I think I just counted and it's 21, which doesn't even feel crazy. I live in a tiny New York apartment, so
But all the auctions are more and more popular with younger generations. The process can still be perceived as intimidating for new buyers. Tell us about your best experience when buying a piece at auction, and why do you think one should buy at auction when clothes are available through so many other outlets today?
actually, one of the things I just added to my wardrobe, I bought at auction and it's amazing. I was searching for the designer Paco Rabanne, who does kind of like sequined and metal work. His work had lasting impact, but designs like that were kind of a dime a dozen in the 60s. So I'd been looking for a non Paco Rabanne sequined 60s dress and found one coming up at auction, which I bought, wore to a friend's wedding, and I've been wearing it all the time. It's really fabulous. I've never seen anything like it. It's not just sequins, it's got flowers made out of sequins. Uh, it is intimidating, I will say, to buy at auction. You have to register, and depending, what kind of auction you're buying at, they might need to see some bank account information. They might need to verify that you're a serious buyer, and that is definitely intimidating. But on the bonus side of that, I would say, particularly when buying clothing, is that you can get an amazing deal. If you find something that no one else is bidding on, you can be the sole bidder, which is honestly the reality with a lot of clothing that goes up at auction. And then beyond that, it's just fun. It makes you feel fancy. It's a way different feeling to win something at an auction than it is to hunt it down in a vintage store.
Mm.
And it's nice to have, depending where you buy from, the provenance and the history of the item as well. A lot of clothing that goes up is from estate sales, so the best you can get is the name of the person who previously owned it, maybe a bit of their bio. But if you're buying on a higher level from somewhere like Carrie Taylor Auctions or Heyman, they'll send you, pamphlets and pamphlets about where they've traced a garment to, all the museums it's been shown in. And while I personally don't own something like that, it is obviously the dream to have that little package of information along with the
Mm.
garment.
I mean, that has obviously an impact on the price, the provenance. But what about for you? If you wear a dress, is that important for you? Can you kind of feel it if someone important wore it before you?
I love I love that myself, and it really is. It's a big debate in the world of fashion history how much people care about that. Like if you look at the Costume Institute in New York, they will only collect items that have never been worn by another person. Versus if you look at the V&A in London, which has probably the only place in the world other than the Kyoto Museum that has a costume collection that rivals the Costume Institute, they will buy things that have been heavily worn. And I prefer things that have been worn because that emotional impact to me is incredible. Just to see, even if you don't know who the person was and you buy a pair of their jeans, you can see, oh, they bent their knees like this. They were this tall because they tailored the jeans to be worn this way. Versus if you buy something that has never been worn, you have the benefit that it's in immaculate condition. And I suppose it depends why you love history. If you love it purely for the integrity of the object, then go for the unworn. But if you love it because you're sentimental and you love the stories and the history that come along with something being worn, I always prefer that.
Mm. Mm. I agree with you. I think it adds something, right, to your experience.
Yeah, and I
Uh,
also love those conversations that come up. Like you'll get people saying, "Oh, my mom had something just like that when I was a kid,"
mm.
or, I had a wonderful woman stop me on the street the other day and say, "You give me hope," because I hadn't seen someone wear white lace tights with a little 60s dress since I was a kid, and I just love it. And so even if you don't know the story, those kind of cultural stories that surround dress are really amazing as well.
Yeah, that's true, and it's references for all of us.
Mhm.
So, how would you recommend to do when style your vintage piece with more contemporary items or dresses?
Um, I always wear vintage clothing with modern shoes because if you wear vintage shoes and vintage clothing, I think most of the time you end up looking a bit crazy. It becomes full costume, and then vice versa. If I'm going to do a more vintage style shoe, I try to do something that's super contemporary on top, like Adidas track pants or, a football jersey, just to kind of mix that up. I like really strong contrasts, and for me, it's always important because 90% of what I wear is vintage or antique. I never want to look like I myself am a ghost from the 1930s. I want to look like I've reimagined those pieces for our modern world.
You're alive. Yeah. So what?
Exactly.
Yeah. But is there a specific item or style that you've been wanting to add to your closet that you haven't found yet, or to
Mm.
your museum?
Again, that list could go on forever. My
Yeah.
current fixation right now is I want a little Yves Saint Laurent, just sort of late 70s, early 80s tuxedo evening jacket, which again is going to, I have no problem waiting years and years. I just added a dress to my wardrobe last summer that I've been looking for 10 years. So each thing that I add to the list is just the start of a decades long rabbit hole.
But what about the sizes when you look at auction or eBay or wherever? Is it the same kind of sizes today that it
No,
was?
so this is challenging, which a lot of times when you buy things, and there's actually been a bigger proliferation of this lately because I just think that people having more access to eBay and Depop and resale platforms has driven this upwards. But a lot of times people will list the measurements of something. So the best thing you can do is know the measurements of your waist. My husband buys a lot of vintage clothing as well, and for him, it's helpful to know the measurement of his shoulders and his arms. For women's wear, there's a lot more room to play with fit, so I find that it's not as helpful. The main thing you need to know is your waist and your inseam, which is great. Um, easy enough. If you have a tape measure, you can do it in your home. The unfortunate part about buying online is that people lie or that everyone measures differently. So you have to kind of work within a 3 inch to, whatever, 3 inch, 7 centimeter gap there of how off someone's measurements might be. In terms of sizing, if something is listed as a numerical size, you first have to know what country it's from, because an Italian 38 is going to fit much differently from a French 38. And then this is a personal, pet peeve of mine, but we do need to recognize in general that people were not significantly smaller in the past than they are now. That's like a weird urban legend that's been pushed for years and years. If human beings had the ability to radically change size within 100 years, we would look quite different now, and like the photos of the past would be unrecognizable. Instead, you have to realize that most of, again, what's been preserved is going to be very small items that were maybe worn by a teenager for a short period of time, and so those are what lasts. So if you want something that's in a more standard adult size, you're definitely going to have to dig more, because those items are either going to be more heavily worn or they're going to be harder to track down, but they are out there.
That's actually a very interesting angle of that. So, for example, I mean, men obviously wore a suit that they maybe bought for their, I don't know, wedding or whatever. And then they were actually wearing the same suit when they were in the coffin at the funeral,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
So, yeah. So that's maybe one reason why you don't find them so much anymore.
Exactly. And the reality is that if any time before 1950 or so, if you had the money to buy an amazing dress for your wedding, as a woman, you would wear that then to every formal occasion. Maybe you'd re-dye it if it were white. It probably wouldn't even have been white, because you would make an economically conscious decision to make it in a material that you would wear again. And so the reality is that a lot of those wonderful, sort of well-fitted garments are gone now.
But hasn't that been a fear, maybe especially among women, that if you show up on two different parties with the same dress, people think, or at least you feel a little bit embarrassed maybe if you meet the same people again
Yes.
the weekend after. But what about you when you
I
have
am
that
totally
antique
against
dresses?
that.
Yeah.
Well, again, I mean, I do like to, I won't lie and say I wear the same thing every day. I do like to reimagine it every day. But if you own a beautiful piece, you have to wear it. And again, I think this is where historical context helps. Like if you grew up in the Middle Ages, you would get one nightgown. And when you were of age, around 13 or 14, you'd be sewn into it, because they didn't do button closures really, even in medieval times. So you'd be sewn into it and you would wear that nightgown for the rest of your life until the day you died, which I can't imagine the intimacy that would lend you with a garment. But it really just helps to have all this context to think like, oh my gosh, what options I have that I'm not literally sewn into my dress. So if I have to wear the same thing a few times this week, or if I want to wear the same thing a few times this week, that's totally fine.
No, that's good. I think that is actually something that we start need to think about if
Yeah,
we should continue with how to say, well, take care of that sustainability aspect of fashion.
absolutely. And even growing up working in fashion, you see these, immaculately dressed women who are wearing outfits that, cost thousands of dollars. And it kind of blew my mind to see that as a teenager. But then you realize they spend that money and they wear those outfits every single day. They come to the office for 3 months wearing the same coat or the same dress. And that really changed my philosophy of style as well. That if you buy one thing that feels integral to your wardrobe and feels integral to your style, you should just wear it every day, particularly if it makes you look good, because then it's faultless.
You said you love color. Is there one color that you can't live without?
Pink.
Pink.
It's we're actually in the wrong bit of my house, but I've got a pink office over there. Everything is pink, and I think like 50% of my wardrobe is pink too.
Pink is not very 1930, is it?
No,
When did pink arrive as fashionable in the fashion industry?
I was saying you will have to ask my husband because he does a lot more color theory than I do. But I will say that generally speaking, we have kind of a skewed perspective on what colors were available throughout the history of dress because I mean, we can't really trust paintings of clothing because there were lots of creative decisions and liberties being taken there. And then when you get to the advent of photography, everything is in black and white. And you can do this experiment at home. It's quite easy. If you take a picture of a neon green dress and you put it in black and white, it'll look like it's white. So our skewed perception of the past is that everyone dressed in very subdued, muted colors, which they didn't. If you look at the history of Victorian clothing, Victorians invented aniline dyes, so you could achieve what we would now consider a neon magenta, you could achieve bright purple, you could achieve these kind of unstable and strange looking, vibrant chartreuse green colors. Um, so by no means are we like the first generation to have really brightly colored clothing. The issue though is that to understand what color something once was, you have to then go back through books of fabric swatches, or you have to read written descriptions, which existed in a lot of women's magazines. They would write out descriptions of what colors and patterns things came in. But it requires a lot more imagination, particularly because clothing dye is very unstable. So it also degrades over time. When we look at a Regency dress that's in a really powdery orange color, it was probably a bright coral once upon a time and it's just degraded. So again, really, really tough to get a solid answer on that. But it's fun if you like going back through old magazines to find suggested palettes for every season. And so you'll see that people were just as fickle as we are now. In one season, they'll say that you should only wear autumn tones with purple and red and brown. And then the next season, they'll say, oh, wait, everyone should wear baby blue satin. So that's fun.
Mm. I guess it also has to do with the actual color, the paint, and what you used for to get the paint, right?
Yeah. I'm sure you know
I mean,
that.
obviously they made it through natural materials at that time, right?
Yeah, and same with dyes. It's exactly the same effect as I'm sure you're more familiar with if you look at paintings from the Dutch Renaissance. They used a form of yellow paint that degrades like almost instantly. So you get these paintings that look like they're like weird bright green colors when really they would have been, these more subtle blue and darker tones. So the exact same thing happens with clothing dye, which all we can do now is move forward with that. But it's nice to imagine what it would have once looked like.
Yeah, true. Is there any items or dress that you can't live without?
Oh, probably a lot. But, uh, gosh, I mean, the nice thing about clothing is that we all need to put it on every day. So essentially, all of us can't really live without it. Um, but I love a good dress. I'm a feminine person, and I like just that being a woman and still wearing a dress, or being a man and wearing a dress, connects you to this awesome history of fashion in a way that I find that other modern garments don't. I love a kilt. I probably couldn't live without a kilt.
Hmm.
Lots of Scottish passion there, but I also think it's just the most utilitarian, awesome, gender neutral garment. And love a good piece of knitwear. I'm very into the history of wool right now as a fiber, so love a wool sweater.
But do you have any Scottish roots, or because you mentioned Scotland before
Hmm.
as well?
No, I just did my undergraduate, well, distantly, like every American, you get like a mix of a million different nationalities. So very distantly, yes. But no,
Yeah,
I just did my art
yeah.
history training in Scotland. So feel
But
passionate
you don't
about
have
that.
your family kilt in the wardrobe, at least.
No, no, which would also be a lie because those were all invented by Victorian English people. So,
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Tell me that story.
really interesting. So you do have some history of tartan, which is a plaid fabric, being native to Scotland, but you also can find samples of it. Actually, there's some preserved in Sweden, and there's some in China as well. So the reality is that tartan was probably a sort of early Pictish tradition, and it is a clever way to weave fabric because of the way it mixes warp and weft. It creates a durable fabric. And then under, hundreds and hundreds of years later, under the reign of Queen Victoria in the 1800s, you get a revived interest in England in Scottish culture. So part of that was hunting down these scraps of Scottish fabric, which are tartan, and Queen Victoria built her Balmoral estate in Scotland, and you get lots more English people traveling to Scotland and romanticizing their history. So then, gosh, his name is escaping me. I must have it written down somewhere. But you have an Englishman who starts categorizing the types of tartan that he sees throughout his travels in Scotland and breaking them up into clans. Whether or not there were
Hmm.
even clans in Scotland is kind of part of their debated national history. So then you have this falsified idea of clans and this falsified idea that each clan has its own tartan. And then these were turned into pamphlets and books that were distributed all throughout fashionable London, and everyone wanted to find their clan tartan. But again, it's just English people imagining a romantic Scottish history. So it's all kind of fake.
This is what fashion history is about, isn't it?
Yeah, yes, just telling everyone that everything's fake. But it gives you freedom
Yeah,
to just wear what
exactly.
you want then.
Yeah. So, what advice would you give to someone who wants to incorporate more vintage fashion in their wardrobe? Where
um,
should you start?
Start with what you can afford and what interests you. Like, notice what you're wearing all the time and see if you can buy a vintage equivalent of that. The main thing that I will say is that, as opposed to shopping new, shopping only vintage or antique or thrifted requires a time commitment. So you're not going to have that instant gratification of saying, like, oh, I want a new sweater, I'm going to pop into the shops and buy it. Instead, you might have to do a couple weeks of research, figuring out, do I want a little 1940s cardigan or do I want a 1970s turtleneck jumper? Um, I think that's like 80-90% of the fun. And then you'll also realize that you'll get much better deals buying vintage stuff. So that's great. But time
Mm.
commitment is the main thing. You have to take a bit of time to know what you want and a bit of time to figure out what kind of platform you want to buy things on. If you have a great local vintage store, then do that. But if you're somewhere where you don't, you're going to have to spend a while, scrolling through eBay and Etsy and all of those, and potentially at auction, buying what you're looking for.
If you could write a motto for vintage fashion and sustainability nowadays, what would that be?
Oh gosh, this is a hard one on the spot. um,
Yeah, no, I agree.
oh man. Okay.
Or any recommendations, at least? I mean, how to think about the fashion vintage and sustainability.
Yeah. Buy less, buy better things, and wear whatever you want. If that means wearing the same thing multiple times, please do it. And if that means that everyone else is buying their low rise Y2K jeans and you want to buy, a floor length wool and velvet dress from the 1910s, then please buy that and wear it because that's what'll benefit you in the long run.
Hmm. With that words, I think we said it all, haven't we?
Yes, I hope so.
Thank you, Ruby.
Thank you, Pontus.
To keep up with the latest trends and receive weekly updates on the art and auction world, subscribe to our newsletter on barnabys.com or read Barnabys magazine online.